You think you know the story of kings, mighty crowns, royal banquets, and absolute power. But buckle up, because the real story of this king is far more disturbing than anything your history class dared to mention. A man so grotesque, so physically ruined, that he became a living nightmare inside his own palace. By the final years of his reign, his body was literally falling apart. His bloated frame was hauled around by contraptions built just to move him. His legs split into gaping ulcers that never healed, oozing pus and rotting flesh that filled entire halls with a stench so horrific servants would rather flee than serve. This wasn't just disease, it was decay in real time. His body had turned into a prison of pain and putrefaction. And the horror didn't end with his last breath. Even death itself couldn't contain the disaster. When his corpse was sealed in a coffin, it swelled, burst, and spilled the king's remains for all to witness. Forget the glorious myths of royalty. This is a story of paranoia, cruelty, gluttony, and a body that betrayed its own crown. This is the horrifying case of the king who rotted alive. By the end of his reign, this king was not ruling a kingdom. He was fighting a losing battle against his own flesh. His body had become a grotesque spectacle, a nightmare so extreme that even those closest to him could barely stand in his presence. Imagine a ruler whose waistline grew wider than the height of the men who served him. Chroniclers recorded that his frame swelled to monstrous proportions, surpassing 400 pounds in an age when the average man weighed little more than 100. His body sagged beneath the weight of endless feasts and unchecked indulgence, and his enormous bulk made even the simplest movements an ordeal. He could no longer walk freely through his palaces. Instead, he had to be hoisted by machines and attended by teams of servants whose every glance was filled with dread. But the horror was not in his size alone. His legs split open into gaping ulcers, festering wounds that refused to close, endlessly oozing pus and rotting flesh. These were not minor injuries, but grotesque cavities that poisoned the air around him. Courtiers reported that the smell of decay spread through entire chambers, so vile that attendants gagged behind perfumed cloths just to survive a few moments near their king. The palace itself became a house of stench, and to serve him up close was considered a form of punishment. Some accounts claim the odor was detectable from several rooms away. Imagine standing outside a hall, hearing the chatter of nobles, and yet being overpowered by the unmistakable stench of a body decomposing while still alive. Servants drew lots to decide who would dare approach him, and more than one attendant was driven to sickness simply by proximity. The monarch who demanded loyalty was now a burden his people secretly feared. Modern scholars believe his decline wasn't just the result of indulgence, but of devastating medical conditions. A jousting accident left him unconscious for hours, long enough that, by the standards of the time, he was practically dead. Many believe this head injury marked the turning point, warping his mind, igniting his paranoia, and accelerating his decline into madness. Others suggest he suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a disorder that could explain his dramatic weight gain, the raging mood swings that terrified his court, and those ghastly leg ulcers that never healed. Yet his physicians, bound by fear, dared not speak the truth. To suggest the king was weak or ill was treason, punishable by death. Instead, they bowed, nodded, and swore he was touched by divine right, even as his body betrayed him in the most humiliating ways. By the end, he could not control even his most basic bodily functions. Special chairs had to be carried to catch his waist wherever he traveled. A man who once stood as the might of an empire now lived like a prisoner inside his own decaying flesh. This was no mere sickness. This was a slow, living death. His subjects whispered that their ruler was cursed, that God himself had marked him, and, perhaps in a way, he had. Because by the final years of his reign, this king was no longer feared for his power. He was feared for the grotesque spectacle of his own body. He was a monster rotting alive, trapped in a throne of agony, paranoia, and decay. Everyone remembers the old saying about this king's many wives, how some were divorced, some executed, and others discarded like broken toys. But the reality of what these women endured was far darker than any rhyme could capture. To marry him was not to enter into royalty. It was to step into a cage built on fear, humiliation, and the looming shadow of death. Take, for instance, the wife who became the target of his most twisted paranoia. He didn't simply decide she must die. He orchestrated a nightmare of false accusations, dragging innocent men into his web of lies. Some were tortured until they confessed to affairs that never happened, while others, her own blood relatives, were forced into the role of scapegoats. One by one, they were executed before her very eyes, each death a cruel prelude to her own. She wasn't just condemned, she was forced to witness the destruction of everything she loved, a punishment far more sinister than the swing of an axe. And then there was the young bride, barely more than a teenager when he claimed her. She was meant to represent purity, the fresh flower of his declining years. But when whispers of her past emerged, his response was nothing short of monstrous. He changed the very laws of the realm, decreeing that failing to confess one's sexual history before marrying the king was now treason. Imagine that, rewriting the law of the land, not to protect the nation, but to soothe his own wounded pride. Her youth, her fear, her vulnerability meant nothing. She was paraded as guilty, condemned, and executed before she even had a chance to understand the enormity of the power crushing her. The psychological torment went far beyond the executions. His wives lived in a world of games designed to break them. One day he would shower them with jewels, lavish them with feasts, and speak the language of devotion. The next, he would turn cold, cruel, and threatening, leaving them isolated in silence. The palace was no home. It was a stage for his shifting moods, where affection and terror traded places like the flick of a coin. Catherine of Aragon, his first, spent her final years in lonely confinement, cut off from her beloved daughter. She died abandoned, penning letters of love to a husband who never bothered to read them. Another wife was so terrified of his wrath that she signed papers pretending their marriage never existed, grateful only to escape with her life. Even the so-called lucky wife, who bore him a son and died of natural causes, found her memory erased before the soil on her grave had settled, her husband already scanning the horizon for his next victim. For these women, escape was impossible. Divorce did not exist, refusal was death, and even compliance could not save them from his whims. They were pawns in the game of a decaying king, forced to smile in public, while terror ate away at their souls in private. To the outside world, they were queens crowned in splendor. But behind the gilded doors, they were prisoners living under constant surveillance, knowing that the man who swore to protect them could order their destruction with a single nod. This is the legacy of his wives, women stripped not only of freedom but of dignity, forced to endure cruelty that rivaled any battlefield. They weren't partners, they weren't companions. They were trophies in a horror story, discarded and destroyed at the whim of a man rotting both in body and in spirit. If you think royal feasts were glamorous, picture this: a king who ate not just like a monarch, but like a man trying to devour an empire. His appetite was legendary, and it became one of the most grotesque features of his reign. By the final years of his life, his meals weren't simply about sustenance. They were performances of excess, paranoia, and obsession. Historians estimate that his daily consumption soared to more than 5,000 calories. To put that into perspective, that's more than double what a healthy man should eat. And remember, this was a man who could barely walk by the end. His diet was not just heavy, it was monstrous. Entire roasted pigs, piles of poultry, endless platters of fish, mountains of bread, oceans of wine. Nothing was too much. His kitchens employed hundreds of staff, producing nearly 1,000 dishes a day just to keep pace with his appetite. To feed him was a full-time military operation, but the strangeness went deeper than sheer quantity. He believed certain foods carried mystical properties, as if by devouring them he could absorb their power. Swans for grace, deer for skill in the hunt, oysters for vigor in the bedroom. He stuffed himself with these so-called magical foods, convinced that his royal body was sustained not by science, but by the divine essence of beasts. It was a grotesque superstition, and one that only fueled his obsession with excess. Every meal was a performance. He would dine before courtiers, dragging the process out for hours, as if daring them to look away from the spectacle of his consumption. Yet even here, paranoia reigned. Every bite of food that reached his lips had to be tested first by multiple servants. These tasters weren't just nibbles. They were expected to wait half an hour after swallowing to ensure no delayed poison took effect. Only then, once his human shield survived, would the king touch a morsel. The process turned dinner into theater. Guards stood at attention as tasters chewed nervously, the hall silent as courtiers watched, waiting to see if death would strike. And when nothing happened, the king finally dug in, while others watched him eat enough food to sustain an entire village. To serve him food was not hospitality, it was ritual, one layered in fear, suspicion, and grotesque indulgence. Even the choice of food reflected his arrogance. Ordinary staples like barley or turnips were banned from his table, not because they were unhealthy, but because they were beneath his royal dignity. He fed only on the rarest, the richest, the most extravagant meals, believing that his crown exempted him from the consequences. The irony, of course, was cruel. As his flesh decayed, as ulcers split open and his body drowned in sickness, he convinced himself that he was beyond mortality. While his body screamed for mercy, he drowned it in wine and meat. By the end, his table was less a place of life and more a stage of decay. Courtiers forced themselves to watch, not out of loyalty, but because turning away could be seen as insult. The smell of his rotting body mixed with the aroma of roasted meat, creating a grotesque atmosphere that no feast could disguise. To dine with him was not a privilege, it was a nightmare. His table, once meant to symbolize abundance and glory, became a daily reminder of his gluttony, his paranoia, and the slow, horrifying collapse of a king who was devouring himself from the inside out. If his appetite showed his gluttony, his paranoia revealed his madness. By the end of his life, the king trusted no one, not his court, not his family, not even his own children. He ruled not with confidence, but with suspicion so extreme that it turned his palace into a prison for everyone inside. His chambers, once symbols of royal splendor, became fortresses of fear. He refused to sleep without loaded weapons beside his bed. Crossbows leaned against the walls, daggers hidden under his pillows. Armed guards stood watch inside his room as he closed his eyes, staring at him through the night. Imagine sleeping under the gaze of armed men, too afraid to dismiss them, too terrified to be alone. This was not a king at rest. This was a man held hostage by the shadows of his own mind. The architecture of his palaces twisted under his obsession. Secret passages crisscrossed the walls, not for romance or escape from boredom, but as escape routes in case assassins came for him. Peepholes were drilled into walls so he could spy on courtiers without their knowledge. Entire rooms were wired with primitive listening devices, so his attendants could eavesdrop on conversations. Every corner of his world became a stage for surveillance, a constant reminder that no word was truly private in his court. And he did not stop at secret holes in walls. He created an army of spies whose sole job was to monitor everyone around him. But even that wasn't enough. He stationed spies to watch the spies, weaving a web of paranoia so tangled that no one could tell friend from foe. Whispered rumors became death sentences. One wrong glance, one careless phrase, could mean imprisonment in the tower, or worse, the axe. This was a man so paranoid that even food became a matter of military precision. Meals had to be prepared in sealed kitchens under guard, with each ingredient tested separately for poison, salt, water, spices, all inspected by different hands. Cooking for the king wasn't service, it was a war operation against invisible enemies. His suspicion infected everything, even his family. He placed spies to watch over his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, treating them not as heirs but as potential traitors. These were children, barely able to comprehend politics, yet their own father saw them as conspirators waiting to rise against him. But perhaps the darkest part was the way he punished not just actions, but even the suggestion of disloyalty. He had men executed for crimes they had not yet committed, condemning them because he dreamed of their betrayal, or because someone whispered they might one day turn against him. Imagine living under a ruler who didn't just punish deeds, but thoughts. A careless word, a passing rumor, or a single moment of suspicion could mean the end of your life. His paranoia spread like poison through the court. Nobles spied on each other. Servants betrayed masters. Families turned inward, terrified of being accused of treachery by association. Everyone walked on eggshells, trapped in the psychological nightmare of a king whose mind was crumbling as surely as his body. This was no longer governance. This was tyranny fed by delusion. His paranoia consumed not just him, but an entire kingdom, turning loyalty into fear and power into poison. The throne was no longer a seat of rule. It was the epicenter of a nightmare, where one man's suspicion held the lives of thousands in its grip. You might think the nightmare ended when the king finally died, but in truth, his death was only the beginning of another horror. His final days were grotesque beyond imagination, a slow collapse of a body already half in the grave. By then, he could not walk. His massive frame had to be hauled through the palace on a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels. And as his attendants strained under his weight, they faced an even worse indignity. Chunks of rotting flesh fell from his ulcerated legs as they carried him. Servants trailed behind with cloths, scrubbing the floors clean of the king's own decaying body. The stench was unbearable, a mix of pus, blood, and the unmistakable odor of death. Imagine being forced to follow your ruler not out of loyalty, but to mop up the evidence of his living decomposition. When death finally came, it did not bring peace. His body, swollen grotesquely with gases of internal decay, had to be wrapped in lead and sealed in multiple coffins to contain the mess. But the containment failed. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor, the unimaginable happened. His corpse literally exploded. The pressure of decomposition burst the coffin apart, spraying rotting royal remains across the inside of the hearse. The smell was so foul that the procession halted as servants scrambled with rags and buckets to clean the wreckage of their king. The most chilling detail. Dogs were seen licking up the spilled remains of the monarch who once claimed divine right to rule. The man who demanded worship in life was reduced to dog food in death, smeared across a country road for peasants to whisper about for generations. Even his burial was chaos. His coffin was so large and heavy that the earth itself seemed to reject it. Graves collapsed, soil gave way, and it took multiple attempts to keep his remains underground. For years afterward, strange noises and foul smells were reported seeping from his tomb. Some said it was his ghost, restless and angry. Others believed it was nothing more than the last gases of a body that refused to stay still. His death left behind not peace, but terror. Servants who handled his body fell ill and died soon after, perhaps infected by the very rot that consumed their king. His court, once terrified of his wrath, was left with a memory so grotesque that no monument could ever erase it. This is the legacy of the king who rotted alive. Not a majestic ruler enshrined in glory, but a walking corpse whose paranoia, cruelty, and gluttony turned one of the greatest kingdoms in Europe into his personal chamber of horrors. A man who decayed in body and soul, leaving behind a story that even history itself struggles to put into words. And if you thought this was the worst history has to offer, think again. Because the past is filled with horrors even more shocking, truths so disturbing that they never make it into your school books. So if this story of the horrifying king who rotted alive made you question everything you thought you knew about royalty, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover more disturbing tales that history tried to bury. Trust me, this was only the beginning.